He's not allowing me to consider anything other than a message given some months ago that precipitated the most violent physical response to anything that I've ever spoken. I'm afraid to try it again. I was taken completely unawares. I was astonished that it evoked that kind of response from the man who sponsored the conference of which I was one of the principal speakers and whom I have known through the years. And probably if I would cite his name, some of you might even know of him. When we came out at the final meeting, he was standing by the entrance of the building leaning against a kind of a rail, and I extended my hand in my typical manner to say, sorry about that. Sorry if I have precipitated any kind of tension or issue or conflict. I really was apologetic, and the man who was holding his Bibles and some other books and struck me on the chest repeatedly in anger and said, Katz, you and your Jewish pride, you and your Jewish arrogance. And when I left him to walk out to the parking lot, there was the worship leader who, whenever he could find occasion, would slip away from the room when I spoke. I never responded to him from the beginning. And he said, if any man had come like you and had spoken so repeatedly about Mexicans or Indians or any other ethnic minority as you have spoken so consistently about Jews, I would by now have hated that minority. I thought, what have I stirred here? What kind of response is this? So here's how I began a series of 3 messages that I'm going to try to telescope and give you in one night. It's more a lecture than it is anything else, and the Lord just gave it to me naively in installments because I had, by the ordinance of God, stopped at a certain American city the night before my arrival in Canada and learned of a synagogue that our hostess in that city had mentioned, and I felt somehow that I should visit it. So she drove us by, and lovely architecture. She may have thought I was only interested in the architecture. She went into the parking lot and around and out. I said, no, I want to go in. Oh, that took her by surprise. And so she parked in the parking lot, and we went in and spent maybe almost 2 hours there, though the rabbi himself was absent. And the secretary showed us about. And I went into the sanctuary, the architecture, the aesthetic appeal of that sanctuary, the elevated ark that contains the scrolls of the law, the beam of the platform where it's taken out and laid and opened and the parchments are read. It was just remarkably touching. And as we walked through the corridors and the hallways, they had photographs, black and white, going back to the early 1920s, the Hadassah Women's Group, the candidates training for Bar Mitzvah, a Purim party with costumes. As I walked by and looked at those photographs, just something of Jewish community, a sense of kinship, what this people have enjoyed for decades in that community. And it just touched my heart in a remarkable way. And I mentioned something about myself without letting the cats out of the bag, that I'd written a book of an early encounter that I'd had with God as a hitchhiking atheist and disillusioned Marxist. And she said, oh, I'd like to read that. I said, I'll bring it to you tomorrow before I leave town. At any rate, I came into Canada still resonating from the visit to the synagogue and how it had touched my deeps. And something about this Jewish community life taking place in our midst, altogether unknown to us, and with whom we are altogether unrelated. And somehow the Lord used that. You're learning a lesson in the preparation of a prophetic man for a prophetic word, using the actual experience of the day and the exposure to which that one is brought to condition and temper his heart, his mind, his disposition, out of which a word of another kind is to come. And here is that word. I said, after 38 years in the faith and traveling the world over and being exposed to the people of God in every condition and in the world itself, I have finally come to the conclusion that anti-Jewishness is intrinsic to all Gentiles by the very nature of things. There is a latent and potential anti-Semitism under the surface of every Gentile life. And all it takes is provocation of a certain kind to have it to erupt and be expressed. And then I began to, off the top of my head, this isn't any scholarly work, just notes that as I'm probing why that is, what are the factors that are resident in our contemporary life that would instigate or serve to turn Gentiles against Jews? And it could be something like Jewish exclusiveness, the way the Jews have maintained their identity apart from the patron nations that have received them. They can be a little exclusive community of themselves and self-contained and barely reflecting or touching the society that has allowed them a presence. And that would evoke something of a Gentile envy of what this Jewish life is that you know exists, but that you're not that you don't contact either imagined or real social, cultural, economic superiority. Something about this strange people that gives us a sense of a superiority that they may not themselves feel, but we suspect that they have toward or against us. Us being Gentiles, they represent and depict something of a God of wrath. If we read the Old Testament and how God had brought Israel out of Egypt and had them to absolutely devastate the pagan civilizations that were in the land ruthlessly and spare not and utterly destroy, it leaves a certain impression about Jews to an unregenerate mind that does not advance or encourage a positive image of Jews, but can cultivate even a sense of fear. That if that's the way that they have dealt with pagan Gentile peoples from the inception of their history, what would they loose on us if they were given the opportunity? The kind of a people to be feared, maybe even a rod of God's judgment, as it was against the Canaanites. And these people convey a thinly concealed contempt of the Gentile, of the Goyim, those that are not like us and are other. Their rejection of Christ and Christianity even makes us to suspect that after all those centuries, they still maintain that posture of rejection of what we think is so dear and central and true. Could it be that maybe we are wrong? Maybe we are in error. Maybe we are maintaining some kind of a fiction, and that these Jews, who are evidently clever and analytical, have not found reason to believe in all these centuries? Does that dispose us maybe to question the security and confidence of our own faith? Their very presence is a kind of sending of a little vibe of those that would make us insecure in what we think to believe is true. Or else, why have they not believed? You see what I mean? Their very presence is as an element that would cause some friction rising up from Gentiles and Christians of a certain kind. So that would makes us maybe to suspect our own creedal claims. Virgin birth, the very presence of Jews in the Middle Ages constituted an unspoken challenge to the uncontested claims of the faith, that when you really think about them, they are essentially foolish and hard to be proved. And imagine shallow Christians in the Middle Ages, Christians in name, who have been thinly indoctrinated about virgin birth, about resurrection, living in proximity to Jews whose very presence is a statement of rejection of those beliefs. There's something that has come up in the whole history of Jews residing in alien communities that causes vibes of dissension and contention that Jesus foresaw and wept. What would be the consequence for the rejection of himself? We Jews have been an indigestible lump in every nation in which we have been cast. Our very unbelieving presence constitutes a kind of attention into the general Gentile communities into which we have been placed. I'm not saying thus saith the Lord in any of this. I'm giving a little lecture on how we should need to understand something of what has gone on in these last thousands of years that is a factor still and under the surface not only of Gentile life, but even Gentile Christian life of a kind. So their very presence would bring into question some of the creedal claims that could now be open to doubt. And that not only that, but that the very survival of Jews and Judaism and their prestigious institutions and synagogues, their prominence and success beyond their number in the population, in the professions in science, they won more Nobel Prizes and Pulitzer Prizes beyond their number, would even make us to question that how can they be so prospered and so distinguished, yet rejecting our Christ? Maybe we're wrong. Maybe they have a handle on something that we've not understood, and that their presence therefore raises even unspoken or unarticulated questions of this kind. So, what shall we say of the miracle of the state of Israel? That God is with them even in their Christ rejection and their rituals, their holy days. There's something about their presence and their position and their demand that if we are to meet with them on the interfaith dialogical table, which is now happening between Christianity and Judaism, it's on the grounds that we acknowledge that their Judaism is as valid as our Christianity. I don't know if you know that. I learned that in seminary, that this new trend is not to evangelize Jews, but to have dialogue with them around the ecumenical table. But the condition that Jews require is that they're not to be objects of proselytizing over that table, but to be looked upon in a position of equality as having a religion equally as valid as ours, and that we will have as much opportunity to learn from them as they from us in the interfaith exchange that takes place at the tables. This is a remarkable thing, and the significance of it is more than I can take time now to express. So they are not some little cowering community of a minority kind just hoping to get by. There's a certain thrust and even prominence, even an aggressive character beyond their small numbers that would rub Gentiles the wrong way, even Gentile Christians the wrong way, if their Christianity is of a shallow kind. Of course, the Jewish claim that the Holocaust is a statement of the bankruptcy of Christianity is not something quickly to be dismissed, and that what is really at the heart of anti-Semitism is the way in which Jews are referred to in New Testament scriptures, so that the root evil of anti-Semitism having its full expression in the Holocaust is the New Testament itself, or Christianity itself. I'm not saying that their view is the correct one, but I'm saying it's one that they hold, and it constitutes an antagonism between the Jewish community and the Christian community. And I've even heard liberal Christians agreeing with this indictment and saying that we need to review our scriptures, and maybe there are certain statements that need to be taken out because they're inflammatory. So it's amazing how much condescension there is to Jewish influence, even in Christian theological circles. And of course, Jewish ethical character is well known, well behaved, prominent in the community. They don't raise their voices to their wives, at least we don't think they do. And they conduct themselves with a certain kind of a dignity that would be the envy even of Christians. And have we sufficiently wrestled with the concept of their election? Have we surrendered our hearts to God's right to choose this people? Is he required to have a criteria based on accomplishment or attributes like ourselves? Why would he choose a people like that and have a destiny for them who have blasphemed his name in all the nations in which he has scattered them? If there's not a real Holy Ghost apprehension of the mystery of Israel's election, I can see that that very election can excite a kind of envy and antagonism in Christians of a superficial kind who do not agree with God's choice and with God's election, or even the God who elects at all, let alone that he should elect Jews. And that the Bible says, Jacob have I loved and Esau have I hated, again sends a disturbing note into nominal Christians that God would elevate and celebrate one over another. And as I've mentioned here in these sessions, though we subscribe to the doctrine of grace, we are more predicated on merit, works, and accomplishment as a basis for esteem than we know. So, the presence of Jews and their inability to forfeit their gifts and callings and to enjoy this kind of covenant privilege despite their apostasy aggravates and reveals the depth of our own Pharisaical hearts. Because if they don't deserve the prominence that they enjoy, and there's yet a future for them and a covenantal relationship that God is obliged to honor, it would kind of get under our skin and rattle us a bit. So there's something about the Jew and their prized place in the purposes of God that would excite a certain kind of irritation on Christians of a kind who are more Pharisaical than they know, who begrudge them their prodigal acceptance by the Father and refuse to attend the feast that celebrates their return, as I spoke earlier today. Though we would secretly prefer that they blew it, and that they have permanently blown it, and that there's no further prospect for their future, and that we alone would enjoy an unchallenged and complete basking in the Father's inheritance. We don't like the idea that they would have a place of return by which they would be given a ring, a robe, and a feast, because we don't have the Father's heart, and we feel that they deserve a permanent rejection, having squandered their inheritance. So we are uncomfortable in acknowledging God as the God of Jacob, and give scant acknowledgement that we have been grafted into their tree. Do you know that? I rarely see any acknowledgement by Christians of gratitude that God has allowed you who are far off and without hope to be taken in and grafted into their tree. They were broken off that you might be grafted in, who were wild branches who by the very nature of your wildness could not bear fruit. The only reason that you're fruit-bearing or capable of being fruit-bearing is that you have been grafted into their tree. It's remarkable how there's an unspoken unwillingness to acknowledge that connection and not to see how grateful we ought to be for the privilege that they were broken off that we might be grafted in. And I even suspect that though we are grafted in, we may condemn ourselves to be not fruit-bearing if we're not grafted in with gratitude. If we do not understand and appreciate the privilege of being grafted into this tree, their tree, whose roots are in God and whose sap and life is his life, flowing through the roots and out to the members, we lose the value of the life and the ability to bear fruit if we're not grafted in with gratitude and spiritually understand and appreciate that privilege. And that may explain more than we know why it is that the church is relatively fruitless, because God is not going to allow the benefit of the sap of his life to flow out to branches that are not grateful in the privilege which is theirs to be grafted into Israel's tree. You need to understand the depth of Gentile pride and intransigence, even as Christians. And that we need to be reminded that the God whom we celebrate and worship is their God. It's the God of Jacob and the God of Israel. And I will never forget how I was in Nuremberg and walking around in a village in a town nearby before the evening's meeting, and visiting a Jewish cemetery that goes back to the 15th century, whose tombstones were so thick of granite that the Nazis could not topple them. And you could still barely discern something of the Hebrew that the weather and age had not effaced. I can't tell you the sense of melancholy for a Jew like myself to walk through a Jewish cemetery in Germany and to see the continuum of Jewish life that goes back to the expulsion from Israel in 70 AD and taken up into the Holy Roman Empire and that which subsequently became Germany. And then to come into the meeting and stand in front of a German audience having a great charismatic time and to say to them, how is it that my people have lived in your presence for 2,000 years and never knew that the God whom you celebrated is their God? Didn't you convey to them that your God is the God of Jacob and the God of Israel? And when I raised that question, I watched German jaws drop. I mean, they actually, like someone had hit them in the solar plexus. The air went out of them. No, they had never really considered that their God is the God of Jacob and the God of Israel. And so I had a thought that I'm not saying, thus saith the Lord, but I think until that acknowledgement comes, and comes not reluctantly but gratefully, we lose something of the value of that God. We do not know him as we ought until we know that he's a God who's not ashamed as being designated the God of Jacob. Because Jacob is a supplanter, a schemer, and we know that the long dealings that he had to receive at God's hand before he could become an Israel. And yet God, instead of disavowing that past and rejecting it, chooses yet to remember and to be identified as the God of Jacob. The question is, do we choose? Have we consciously made that identification? Because if we have not, I believe there's a dimension, an important dimension, that is lost to us from God as God. There's something about the mystery of this relationship with this Jewish people that has got to be reconsidered. And maybe for the reason of that loss, we're trying to find some other avenue by which it can be made up. And I just suspect prophetically that it has everything to do with our desire to find a source of energy and life and hope in revival. If only we can find a revival that will bring to us a dimension lost from our failure to recognize God as the God of Jacob, and the dimension that comes to us from the flow of the sap of his life from the tree into which we have been grafted, because it waits on a grateful acknowledgement of that privilege. And we want to make up for that deficit by something external like a revival. Just a thought. And I wonder how much God will honor that attempt to compensate in some other way for what he intended in a relatedness with his people, which our Gentile pride will not acknowledge or allow. Whew, that's a heavy thought, Art. And that we're barking up the wrong tree to think that there can be a compensatory something coming through revival that God intended in his wisdom to be obtained in our connectedness with Israel. And what are we in fact getting? And who is the God of the revivals that we're seeing stimulated these days in Toronto, Pensacola, and elsewhere that have a lot of activity, energy, dynamic going for it, but seem to subside? They don't seem to bring a lasting dimension, so that I'm not saying that you're obliged to receive my opinion, but I am suspicious, and I'm waiting for the kind of revival that will come in the restoration of the intended relationship of the church with the people of Israel. Its tree and its God, as the God of Jacob. When I'll see a revival that has at its center this conscious restoration of what has been historically lost, I will have confidence that that revival is in God and not some spurious source that at the very least can be questioned, if not dismissed. In fact, I've come to a place, you guys can pray for me, that everything that the church lacks, its every malady, its every defect, can be traced back in the last analysis to the want of this kind of recognition of its relatedness to the Jew. And when that centerpiece is lost, we of necessity go off in deviant directions and find ourselves celebrating men, celebrating dubious ministries, barking after revivals of some kind of spurious and questionable kind that don't leave us in a better condition but a worse. We read, for example, the commencement of the 3 great chapters in the book of Romans on the mystery of Israel, 9 through 11, where Paul commences by saying, I would wish myself a curse for my brethren's sake, that they might know Christ. It's a remarkable cry. And we say, became Jewish to have this kind of heart's cry for Israel. And the fact that we have not had it is because we so easily attribute that to Paul's Jewishness rather than to his apostolicity. But if the genius of what is apostolic is this identification, this heartfelt cry for the lostness of Israel, then it's available to us if we will come into the authentic apostolic thing of which this kind of cry and identification is a high mark. It makes an implication for us of a radical kind if we don't just attribute it to Paul's ethnic Jewish identification with his kinsmen. And the fact of the matter is, are they not also our kinsmen? That he will wish himself a curse for his brethren. But are they his brethren because of the racial and generic identification? Or his brethren in the sense in which the Lord says in Matthew 25, that if you did not do it unto the least of these my brethren, you did not do it unto me. That God is speaking in Matthew 25 of something that he expected as a mercy coming from the church to the least of these his brethren. And some of the commentators say it can't be Jews, because the only use of the word brethren prior to that time is speaking of the church. But I believe that the text itself shows that those who are saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry, thirsty, and naked, are already the Christians. So who then are the brethren who are the least, if not the Jews in their last days' flight and of exile and movement through the nations, when they shall be the least of these his brethren? But are they our brethren, is the question. Not because we're born Jewish, but because we have been brought into their commonwealth, into their covenants and hopes, grafted into their tree. The failure to recognize them as brethren shows that there is still an inhospitable disposition, even on the part of Christians, to recognize this identification and this linkage. Talk about Jewish pride, of which I was accused. Maybe the issue is more Gentile pride and even Christian pride, which will nowhere be more revealed and found out than in our response to this people. They serve a purpose in God in revealing to us our secret hearts that we would never have seen or even considered except for their existence and what they represent and how they chafe us and how we keep ourselves at a distance from them and secretly cannot find a basis for identification with them. So we do not, as a rule, pray for the peace of Jerusalem except in the most perfunctory way, kind of a 30-second obligation, and then move on to other things. Nor are we watchmen on the wall who will give him no peace till he make Jerusalem a praise in the earth. By and large, as the church, we are not conscious, let alone smitten, that we have been ignorant of the mystery that Paul speaks of in Romans chapter 11. And when I said this in this speaking where I was assaulted, I said, I have to reflect that as I have gone on through the years and I have had the privileged relationship with Bible speakers of international renown who have admitted to me, Art, I have to say that Romans 9 through 11 remains for me a mystery. I've never understood it. I don't speak it. It's just outside of my consideration. Oh, I said, really? But now I have to say, how can a renowned Bible commentator make such a confession so nonchalantly as if, well, tough about that? Too bad. It's just something that I've not seen and I have to omit. Why aren't you grieved that you are ignorant of the mystery of which Paul says, I would not have you to be ignorant, lest you become wise in your own conceit? I'm not faulting you for not seeing the mystery. I am faulting you for your casual nonchalance that you can afford not to know the mystery as if, well, so what? So I missed that one point. But you dear man, that one point is central to the whole apostolic framework of understanding. It's at the heart of Paul's whole apostolic mindset. And you can afford not to know it without even a ripple? Why aren't you ashamed that the revelation has not come? Why haven't you confessed and cried out and sought the Lord for it? How is it that you dismiss it as if it's only some secondary kind of a thing that you can well afford to miss because you have such a grasp on so many other things? There's something in your attitude that needs to be identified and repented of. As if this is not a mystery of any real consequence, and therefore we can well afford to receive the penalty of becoming wise or inflated in our own conceit to the degree that that conceit nullifies the character of the church in its lamb-likeness. Because conceit and humility are irreconcilably different. And if the church has lost its essential humility and has become conceited and wise in its own conceit, how is it then the church in any apostolic sense? This is a mystery we cannot afford to lose. And that our greatest spokesman can boast that they don't know anything about it as if it's not a matter of great concern is a statement that should concern us. So we have been witness to the ages-long tragedy of Jewish suffering, as I described some episodes today, where entire Jewish communities were wiped out at their own hand. Kiddush Hashem was sanctifying the name of the Lord by not condescending to those who were threatening us either that we would convert or be killed, but rather than face that option at their hands or submit our wives or daughters to their lusts, we slew our own children and slit the throats of our own wives. Can you imagine a Jewish husband doing that? And then died either at one's own hand or that of a brother. So that when the doors were finally burst down and the mob enraged came in to take their loot, they found every Jew dead at his own hand. And I'm raising the question, this has been going on historically through the ages in Christendom and has come at what Jews think to be Christian hands. After all, these guys wore white crosses on their tunics, and if they're not Christians, what are they? They're not Jews, they're not Muslims. This is Christian brutality. And why haven't we who believed thrown our own bodies in the way of those that are persecuting God's people, Israel? How do we stand aside or look away and allow this kind of decimation of God's people, even in their unbelief, even in their apostasy? As I asked a German brother some years ago in Berlin, an older man who remembered the Nazi time, he said, Art, I looked down from my apartment window and I saw the arrival of these brown-shirted Nazis with their swastika armbands, and they were smashing Jewish store windows and yanking the beards of elderly Jews and beating up the children, making these Jews to scrub the sidewalk with toothbrushes in a humiliation. Oh, I said, you saw that? What did you do? He said, what could I do, Art? I pulled the shade down and I walked away. I want to say historically, the church has pulled the shade down and walked away. Which is a statement that we need to acknowledge and to repent for and pray for a grace of God, not just a kind of momentary heroism, but something so formative in us and the character of God that rather than walk away, we would rather interpose our own bodies between those who are assailing Jews and their defenseless victims. I said to a black brother here this morning, I have a sense that there's a special destiny for black believers with Jews, to guard them from the outrage, hatred of their own black kinsmen who are unsaved and unregenerate and can be provoked to a violence against Jews as being their exploiters, and that you are called to stand between the assault that comes from your own kind against them. Your greater identification is with unsaved Jews than with those of your own race and origin. I know that there's a Hasidic community in Brooklyn, smack dab in the midst of a black ghetto. What are they doing there? They moved there from Long Island and other places where they had nice homes and even estates because they wanted to be in a place where they could walk to their synagogue, because you can't drive on the Shabbat. And the only place where they could find reasonable accommodation in houses is the rather run-down brownstone area that's inhabited by blacks. And so right in the midst of the black community is this ultra-Orthodox Hasidic presence. And there have been ripples and resentments already in past years when a Hasidic kid driving a car hit a black kid in the street and killed him. And there was a 3-day riot that was only quelled by the mayor of New York City, who was at that time himself a black man. So there's a tension. So who knows that I'm not speaking of something of a too far-fetched kind, where we will again have an occasion actually to interpose our bodies between those who are assailing Jews and be willing to suffer that violence upon ourselves rather than it should fall on them. I'm raising the question, why have we failed, we, the church, failed to be that and to do that historically in defense for this people who are the least of these, his brethren? Do we share the Lord's ache and his identification with them that in all their affliction he is afflicted? Nor will he be the deliverer who comes out of Zion until we share his pity and commiseration for them, as we spoke this morning out of Psalm 102, when we shall have compassion for their stones and pity upon their dust. So we do not anticipate the soon coming time of Jacob's trouble, nor have we bothered to make any preparation to succor them in their exile and flight, and leave it to others to prepare a place for them in the wilderness where they will be fed for 3.5 years. The question needs to be asked, if we have cast away his people whom he has not cast away. For Paul says, God hath not cast away his people whom he foreknew. How then can we still call Jesus Lord, not realizing that the restoration, all Israel shall be saved, waits upon some condition of our own when the fullness of the Gentiles come in, and that the issue of his covenant faithfulness and mercy is the very demonstration of himself as God, as he will manifest itself to a people who do not deserve that attention. That the issue of their return and their salvation, because of the covenant which I have made with them, is not so much the issue of their deserving as the issue of the God who makes covenant and is obliged to honor it. And that if he cannot and will not, how does he remain as God? And that there's a jealousy, that ought to be a jealousy in our heart for the fulfillment of his word, his promise, his gift, his callings, especially with regard to them who are the least likely candidates to deserve such consideration. But it's the issue of God's mercy and faithfulness, not what they are, but what he is. Because he will have mercy upon whom he will have mercy, and compassion upon whom he will have compassion. And can we be indifferent to what God's compassion and mercy is? And not be smitten that we are unaffected, indifferent, immune, and even little cool to his choice of the people whom he has chosen. Only when we, in humility and gratitude, affirm the privilege of being placed as wild branches into their tree. Will we do not stand in awe and have become proud, not recognizing his kindness, and have not continued in kindness therefore toward them, and who will languish in that condition unless that kindness and mercy is extended through us. Have we ourselves been cut off already more than we know? Though we are technically grafted, we are effectually cut off and not receiving the life because of this distance and unwillingness to affirm the connection that God in His wisdom has required, not knowing the depth of our own pride, even as Christians. So, what then is our supply if we're looking for it from other places? And who is supplying it? What is our quest for revival independent of the life that comes from the conscious connection with the mystery of Israel? Can God possibly honor that and defeat His own purposes and deny His own glory? Our Gentile pride and subtle disdain for Israel and the Jew robs us as the church of the life and grace not to be given in any other way except through the way that was ordained in our connection with their tree and with Jacob, with God as the God of Jacob. And the fullness of the Gentiles that God is waiting to come in, that He can deliver, that deliverance can come out of Zion, are we waiting for, expecting, and desiring that fullness? What is that fullness? It's more than I mentioned this morning, the issue of numbers. It's the issue of identity. It's the issue of, as Gentile Christians, coming into a fullness of what is Hebraic and what is Davidic, what God intends for us from a salvation which was of the Jews. It's not that it just belongs to them, but it brings a quotient and a consequence, a benefit of a very particular kind that is transforming and saves us out of our Gentilism and brings us into a quality of being, of reality and life that is Hebraic, that is Davidic, that is really a salvation to the uttermost, and it's that fullness for which God waits. It will not come to us in our indifference. It will come to us in our seeking and in the recognition of the connection that God intends in His wisdom with His people, even in their present lostness. So, how do we break that vestigial Gentile pride that has kept the church historically from the connectedness with His people that God intends? And I want to conclude with a verse in Genesis of the blessing that Noah prophesied over his 3 sons and has a lasting significance right to the present moment that needs to be fathomed. When Noah said, "Cursed be Canaan, the servant of servants he shall be to his brothers," but he also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." The message that I concluded with, where the man struck me with his Bibles in anger, was an invitation for the Japheth church that has been enlarged to come into the tent of Shem. That there's something in the wisdom of God, that Japheth is blessed in his enlargement, and all of the European nations have reflected that, including Great Britain. Technology, commerce, trade, culture. Japheth is enlarged, but the very thing that enlarges him and blesses is also contains a prospect for destruction, as we have seen from Germany, as we have seen even in the imperial policy and conduct of Great Britain itself, that Japheth left to himself in his enlargement can be a source of curse as a blessing, except he come and dwell in the tents of Shem. There's something to be found in Shem of a unique blessedness, and the fact that it's a tent is suggestive of a certain kind of spiritual disposition of a people who have not found the world and made it. They are transient, they are pilgrims, they're sojourners. But the thing is that Jews themselves who are called to constitute that tent are more today like Japheth than they are like Shem. We ourselves excel in the field of technology and military power and all of these kinds of things. So God's resolution for mankind to take the brittle edge off of the Gentile nations and to compensate for their hardness and their pride and their arrogance that comes with their enlargement through their ability, is to be found in one place only, the tent of Shem, where there the God of Shem resides and brings a certain quotient and presence of a spiritual kind that will militate against the rough, aggressive, proud character that necessarily will follow Japheth because of his enlargement. Can you understand this mystery? The end of the age is the sons of Japheth, the European nations, bending and bowing to enter the tent of Shem and dwelling there to receive there alone that dimension from God that saves Japheth from himself, that saves men from their own ability, their own aggressiveness, their own pride. Because there's something in Shem and the God of Shem that is a compensation, is a quality and a character of another kind. And it's only to be found there. And so I gave a final invitation at that conference. And this is when my host went bonkers. I invited every Gentile Christian in the audience who heard themselves being described by the material that I've shared with you, to one degree or another, realizing that their distance and difference from the Jew and a disposition of hostility and irritation is theirs even as Christians, and that something needs to be broken that can be broken only in a unique way that God has intended when you enter the tent of Shem. That characteristic, that Gentile thing that survives and is carried with us even into the faith and into the church, needs to be broken in the one place that God intends, the tent of Shem. But you can't enter that tent without bowing. It requires a breaking and bowing in order to enter and to dwell. And this is the thing from which a proud religionist would shrink. And I gave an invitation for as many in the congregation who sense that something remains of their Gentile inheritance that is antagonistic to Jews, that has not allowed them the acknowledgement of the privilege of being grafted into their tree and receiving the life that flows from its roots, and have sought other compensatory ways outside of the mystery of God's intention and provision with this people to come and break by bowing to enter. What would you have done if you had heard that invitation and recognized that in fact you need it? And that something will linger of a gentilic, resistant, Japheth kind that can only be met and broken in bowing and entering. So I finished my message and I was picking up my Bibles, and this brother who was a sponsor came and took the microphone. I thought, oh, praise God. God has touched his heart because he is a Gentile of the Gentiles. Canada, Anglo-Saxon, British colony, still retaining this essential superiority and indifference. I thought, oh, praise God, the Lord has spoken to his heart. And he's going to take the microphone and say to the congregation, the Lord has really revealed my deepest need. I had not recognized it till I heard these things from Art. And I want to say, I want to be the first to break and bow and enter the tent of Shem and find there dimensions for my own Christian life that wait for me only in that place. Instead, I could not hear him because I wasn't wearing my hearing aids, and I was behind him, he was in front, and what he was saying was, I nullify this invitation. This is bowing to another God. And he went on like that, and I didn't hear that. And when he handed me back the microphone, not having heard what he said, I said, my invitation still stands. And you know what the heck of it is? People came forward with weeping to bow and to break and to enter. And then the meeting ended, and I went out the building, and there he was standing by the railing, and I extended my hand in naive apology, and the man reacted with such anger, he actually beat me on my chest with his Bibles and books. Katz, you and your Jewish pride, you and your Jewish arrogance. I thought to myself, well, maybe there is something of an arrogance and pride. But why identify it as Jewish? You know what I said to him? I said, dear brother, had you bowed to enter that tent, you would have seen everything differently from the new light and perception and revelation of a kind that would have been available to you only in that place. And what you have described as arrogance, you would have seen as a perfect obedience to the God who had me both to speak and to invite. Well, is that a concluding message? Is that a mystery? For how does the age end? In Zechariah chapter 14, that all who survive of the nations who have opposed Israel, in verse 16, chapter 14 of Zechariah, that have come against Jerusalem shall go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the festival, the feast of booths, of tabernacles. And if any of the families of the earth do not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain upon them. And if the family of Egypt do not go up and present themselves, think of the humbling here, and present themselves, and go up and present themselves, is an entering the tent of Shem. It's a breaking of Gentile pride. It's an acknowledgement of the nations that God has honored and celebrated this nation. And something will be to their benefit that will save them from their own Japheth character if they will come up and present themselves and bow to enter the place that God has identified where they ought to find blessing in a redeemed Israel. Such shall be the punishment, verse 19, of Egypt, the punishment of all the nations that do not go up to keep the festival of booths, the ingathering of the nations. And on that day there shall be inscribed on the bells of the horses, holy to the Lord, and then a further description of the holiness that comes into Jerusalem as the redeemed people of God. There shall no longer, the last verse, be traders or Canaanites in the house of the Lord of hosts on that day. The footnote of these verses at the bottom of my page says that Zechariah celebrates the restoration of the temple and of Israel's place in the purposes of God that finally become fit to serve as a worship center for the whole world in the new age. The one outrage of Jesus that overturned the money changers' tables was not against sacrifice, was not against the priesthood that had lost its character. It was against those who had turned the house of prayer for all nations into a place of merchandise. What grieved the soul of Jesus to an act of violence in overturning the tables, that his house is intended as a house of prayer for all nations. And you have made it a house of merchandise and a den of thieves. The whole purpose for your being as my elect nation was to offer to the nations a tent, a place to come, to dwell, to worship, to find, to recognize, and to be touched, and to be blessed, and to receive the redemptive benefit of coming to the locus of my own presence in a redeemed Jerusalem, to come into my house and into my tent. But you have kept the nations at a distance by not fulfilling your call and turning a house intended as prayer for the nations into a place of merchandise and a den of thieves. Unless you understand the heart of Jesus that led him to be physically violent in overturning it, you'll not understand the mystery of the tent of Shem, which is the tabernacle of God, which is the house of worship for all nations, which is the coming into the place that God has designated for the Japheth peoples of the world, who left to themselves and without the tempering benefit that comes from the presence of God in the tent of Shem alone, will be a destructive force in the world, as we have seen in both world wars and may yet again see. There's a mystery, dear saints. And the people that God has called to constitute that tent, ironically, are themselves more like Japheth than they are like Shem. Look at Israel today. In its commerce, its trade, its power, its military thing, its high-tech society. How are they going to be to the Gentile nations what they ought when then themselves have become Gentilized and want to be the Hong Kong of the Middle East and not the haven and the house of God for all nations? Something has got to be demonstrated to them of their own call by a people who have come into the Shemite identity, the church, and will demonstrate to Israel what its own calling is, all the more radically when we can demonstrate it authentically, not being Jews by birth, but Semites by inheritance and by acquisition and by our identity with their tree and with their God, the God of Jacob, and the whole Davidic inheritance which is ours through Scripture and through the Spirit. Paul says, I'm a man out of time and out of joint. What you see in me is a picture of the calling of my own nation, as I am the apostle to the Gentiles. Isn't that remarkable? That this man with this great Talmudic and rabbinical background is made the apostle to the Gentiles, and Peter the fisherman is made the apostle to the circumcision. What is God up to? What he's up to is this, that Paul is demonstrating in his relationship to the Gentile church what is the future of the redeemed Israel to the Gentile nations. And we don't even know it as Jews. You have got to demonstrate to us what is our own Semitic calling by showing us our apostolate by your own conduct and the reality that you exhibit in the truth of your own faith, which is Semitic in the deepest and truest sense, because you constitute the tent into which even the Jewish people must come and bow and break from their own perverse corruption and find their own true identity in what you have found before them spiritually. This tent of Shem is a mystery, but you need to bow to break to enter it. I want to pray for a church that will raise up the tent that has fallen down, that the people for whom it's intended might find in what you have retained and established their own call, their own identity, and be to the nations what God intends, and complete the mystery of redemption that begins with the blessing of Noah on his sons, that Japheth shall be enlarged, but shall dwell in the tent of Shem. So, Lord, this is an exploratory word. This is feeling our way into mystery, into dimensions, my God, that have been lost to us. But we have to consider what would so antagonize a leading biblical commentator of world renown to so strike this servant in such anger, almost to a fury and a rage, and identify my error as being Jewish pride and Jewish arrogance, because I spoke the things there that I spoke here. What is it that antagonized him? What is it that for which he was still susceptible and could be pricked and respond in so ungainly a way in a man who is ordinarily as quiet as a mouse, whom I had never, in all the years I've known him, ever heard him raise his voice? Only then something pricked him, something found the blind side, something touched him in his deeps, that he reacted in an anger against what he identified as Jewish pride and Jewish arrogance, which is maybe more the statement of his untempered Japheth character, even as a renowned teacher, than it was of my own character and condition. And if a man of that renown can still have a lurking anti-Jewish Gentile Japheth disposition that has never been broken, what shall we say of us? And so there's a quality of brokenness that is becoming to the church that can be found only in one place, when we will condescend to bow and to enter into that realm, my God, of those things pertaining to that people, for which everything in our Gentile experience would keep us.